I was intrigued by David's comment that at BP he wasn't bombarded by reports from other companies. When I started working in The Hague, I wasn't really aware that there were other companies. Maybe it was just the Dutch conservatism or whatever, but once I moved to Houston and Dallas, I found there were other companies out there, and we talked to them. But not only did we talk to them, we also traded data with them. And there was a big, big world of data brokerage out there, which I'd never been aware of when I was in The Hague. So even at Exxon, we talked to other people. Right, I'm trying not to stand on the same ground that David has. Although I do quite a lot of work for the APG, my day job is actually trying to inform politicians and the so-called intelligence community in Washington about shale oil and shale gas, and in areas where they don't really have much idea of what's going on. So we have about 100 people in Washington just dealing with information transfer, and some field offices in places like Bismarck, Midland, and other wonderful places. So my talk is entitled A Very Different Ballgame. And when I talked to somebody in Berkeley, they said to me, "Oh, come on, Tony, you're being ridiculous. You can't compare these two. You can't. Why don't you look at somebody, a basket case failing American football sides like the Raiders, and compare that with some... Surely there aren't soccer teams who play to 3 people and a dog and play in those conditions." But it is a very different world. Earlier this year, I think in June, Professor Andrew Applin of Durham was talking about from UK resources to reserves, terms which are often confused in the media. And he said, what is required? And the real answer is some data, some meaningful data. Now, at a meeting next month in Warsaw, there are going to be sessions on what I would call data-poor countries, the ones on the right. The USA, from what we've heard today, is obviously data-rich, and so is Canada to some degree. But I fear that I'm not going to hear anything new. I'm not going to see any new data in most of these countries to what I saw 2 years ago in Warsaw. The world is moving very slowly. Well, we can all talk about rig counts, and you could go and talk to Martine Davis, Drilling Info, and she's got lots of information, and she could direct you to where the main information databases are. There are currently 1,931 rigs drilling in the States, of which quite a large number, about 2/3, are horizontals. And that's the breakdown by state. You can see there's an awful lot in Texas, there's still a few in Oklahoma, but decreasing. There's a lot in North Dakota and New Mexico, and there's a sizable population in Canada. We have, as far as I'm aware from DEC, there are 9 boreholes currently being drilled in the UK, of which 7 are development boreholes. There are just 2 exploration boreholes being drilled. Just doing it on basin. David was ranking basins, and if I had to put red lights and green lights, I'll talk about some red lights later, but I think my brightest green would be on the Permian Basin. These are the 3 I work on currently. I've worked on the Barnett since 1993, but I've only worked on these 3 since 2003. But these are my green lights. If you don't want to call it the Worston Basin, let's talk about Bakken. yeah, I want to mention that that rig count, to some degree, hides a picture that quite a lot of new high-spec rigs are coming on board in the States. Just one company has produced, I think it's 10 new rigs this year. So there's a lot of, Francis talked a couple of years ago maybe, at one of these meetings, about rigs which were capable of drilling deep holes, long laterals, and how many of those were in the lower 48 states. She also said that, I think you said there was something like 90 to 92% of fracking capability resided in the lower 48. Our work suggests it's probably nearer 95% now. It's a big concentration. So there are quite a few new rigs, high-performance rigs, coming on board in the States this year so far. Well, if you look at the first sentence in the BGS deck report on the Boland-Hodder Basin, the first sentence is shale gas in the UK is in its infancy. And to me, this is 2013, nothing much has changed. Now, we were talking about high reputation people we would trust. And one person I do trust is Mike Daly. And Mike opined in the Telegraph a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, that after the gold rush high, the industry needs time and space. How much time we can give it is another thing. The reality is that British shale is a long-term research project. And I'm very much, I don't want to dampen Amy should call me a pessimist, but there we go. So far, 6 shale gas wells have been drilled in the UK. And you've got the spud dates there for pre-salt number 1, that date, and that's the completion date. It strikes me that some of these wells took an awful long time to drill. People in the States would be getting a bit bored after 7 months, 6 months. But no shale gas wells are currently drilling in the UK. And this is the DEC website as of the 8th of September 2014. So, not much data there. I don't know the cost of these wells, because I'm not party to that. And I think there's only one person in the room who's probably seen the latest 3D survey that Grindrod obtained recently in that area. And I'll say more about it. Seismic yes, seismic no, a little bit later. So there have been a lot of wells in the States since that time. That figure at the top, that 110,000, includes all sorts of things. It involves conventional, unconventional, CBM, the whole lot. There are just 2 exploration wells being drilled in the UK at the moment. There's the one that spudded September 2nd down in Sussex, very close to Gatwick. That's the Forest Hill number 1, it's conventional oil and gas well. And the Wound number 1 is up in Lincolnshire. Otherwise, all the wells currently drilling in the UK are development wells at Wych Farm. Now, I tend to get asked very different questions in the UK to the questions I'm asked in the States. And these things, John Simmons mentioned this morning that these are common issues that we come across in the UK. And, to my mind, a lot of these have already been answered. In the States, I get very different questions. One company I could possibly name, I said to Deirdre this morning, they told me that they've got 5,000 staff just dealing with permits, leases, mineral rights. That is a lot of people. They're not all geoscientists by any means, but they have a good feel for what's going on in those areas. So the other question I get is, what did my neighbour get in terms of royalties? What sort of deal did they get? Dave talks about our old shales the same. There is enough data out there. If you go to the Drilling Info website, or you talk to Martine, you will find that there's an enormous database out there that allows us to plot trends, not just in plays, but in counties and between operators. There is a whole range and spectrum of performance criteria out there, and we have enough data to be able to make sense of it. So we can look at, why do IPs, why do initial production rates vary so much between Wells companies and counties? What is a total stimulated volume? How do you know? One thing I don't think I've heard today is about microseismic. And there is a tremendous amount of information coming from microseismic in wells now. Who was it? It was John who showed that picture of tree-like fracks growing upwards and downwards. They don't look like that at all. We know what they look like, generally, because the microseismic information in the wells is now so good. Why are decline curves so different? I think it was Neil who said something, I think it was Haynesville, he quoted. And the Haynesville is a particularly difficult one to deal with. But there are a tremendous number of different decline curves that we can look at in different plays. BGS make a big deal in the Hodder-Boland report about, well, how they've calculated resources and how they have used a Barnett shale analogy. Now, I think that if you use decline rates for the first 10,000 Barnett wells, you would get a very different picture from the last 10,000 that have been drilled. Or maybe if you took Barnett wells, you know, this is all about sweet spots, if you took Barnett wells from the area, the counties, maybe 2 or 3 counties around Fort Worth, you'd probably get a very, very different picture of decline rates. You know, I get weird questions like, why are the oil companies getting precedence over farmers for rail freight? Basically, they can pay for it. The farmers are up in arms in North Dakota that they can't get space on trains to transport their produce. We forget in this country, well, some people forget, that American rail is all about freight. There are vast quantities of materials carried in by rail and carried out by rail. So, different infrastructure. Final two, do all fracs have the same success rate? Well, no, they don't. They have very different success rates. Some are not successful at all. Now, I've heard figures quoted as high as 25%, maybe redundant. We've got to do something about that. And finally, vast quantities of proppant are used at the moment. There are people here who probably get around that. But where does all the proppant go? Are we sure we know where it goes? Have we got continuity of supply of proppant? You know, as a sedimentologist, I kind of worked years ago on grain size and grain shape and texture and things like that. People are also involved in looking at the types of proppant. I could go to a catalogue and I can choose my proppant accordingly. By spending so much money on it, I might as well do. Well, our data so far is largely public sector. Data is largely in 3 areas, 3 reports. And, okay, I haven't seen the 3D seismic from Quadrilla. I haven't even seen all of that data yet. But I still don't know where the sweet spots are within the Boland Hodder system. I really don't think we've got the data to do that. The Boland Hodder system worries me because it is very thick in some areas and it's not as thick in others. It's got a whole lot of very complicated fault systems. It's had a complex burial history and complex inversion in some areas. It's been uplifted again. So it is a pretty complex structural geology story. I would like to see a bigger spread of data, as I say, to get something nearer the sweet spots. If you go to the seismic, BGS has admitted that the quality of seismic data is from poor to moderate. Now, I can pick the top of the Boland-Hodder system. I can pick that quite easily on seismic. I'm not quite so confident about the masonry unit. It's a pretty poor reflector, and it's pretty complex. Now, my idea, I was brought up on the Boland shale, and it shows dramatic lateral facies changes, and it shows dense, complex fault systems. Now, we've got in the audience Anshel Manu, and he, from Schlumberger, he probably knows as much about stress regimes in the Boland-Hodder as anybody, so he's the guy to talk to if you need some information on that. And then, of course, we came down to the wheel basin, which obviously didn't include the Wessex Basin in that report. And then we've got the real pessimism from BGS coming through about the Central Valley of Scotland. And really, I was amazed that BGS were quite so brave as to deny their government masters and say, really, there's nothing much going on here, and it's not going to be. Well, my first exposure to all this was I went down to the Vulcan number 1 well back in 1986 when Conoco were drilling this. And the core in carbonates from the Middle Jurassic in that time. And I had really not much idea of what their other targets were. Back to the kind of green light, whatever. I think one of my points is off to the left there. I'll have to enlarge on that. The temptation is to think that a lot of things in the States are just leading to a pot of gold. Now, if you look at all the data, there are great changes in where companies are obtaining leases, in things like the Antrim up in Michigan. Also, to some degree in the Utica, certainly in the Haynesville, and in the Anadarko Basin, the Arcona Basin. You've only got to look at where leases are being traded, where companies are actually monetizing their assets. I got out of Barnett Shale about 10 years ago because it was certainly a red light to me in those days. The three real green lights are obviously the Bakken, the Permian Basin, and the Eagle Ford. And I would make the point that those areas have long histories of conventional exploration. David has made a point. Most of what I know about carbonate diagenesis has come from the Permian Basin and the Williston Basin. Those are, information I can get from well logs. I'm not saying I understand all the well logs. I'm happy enough, I'm on safe ground when I'm looking at sandstones. I find petrophysics of carbonates an order of magnitude more difficult. And I was always told by the guys at Schlumberger that they find shales another order of magnitude more difficult to deal with in some cases. One thing that's off to the side there, in California, Neil McMahon told me some time ago that he thought thick is not necessarily great. Now, the Bowen Shale is thick in some areas. The Monterey in California is very thick, very variable, and I would not profess to know where the sweet spots are so far. The Monterey has got problems. To me, very thick in terms of plays means very expensive, means a lot of wells. And I fear there might be a lot of wells needed in the Bowen Shale. Some people have made a point about well trespass in the UK, where you can drill down and then drill a lateral under a number of people's properties. Now, I haven't been to anywhere in the States recently. I haven't been to any drilling pads where the lateral goes under more than one property. And it's relatively easy to deal with one or a limited number of landowners. The mineral rights cease to be very complicated. most of the people I talk to, they can't actually see their neighbour's property. You know, the boundary might be 20 or 30 miles away. And that's the same, very different topography, but when you go down to the Eagleford, this is near Laredo, and again, I can't, okay, it's misty, but I can't really see the neighbouring property on there. I always, when I see this diagram, this one's from Poland, and I always think of David Cameron's statement once, you know, fracking pads about the size of a cricket pitch. I don't think so. And that's not a particularly enormous one. I'm asked a lot about water, and water is certainly a local issue. Water use in North Dakota is a very different matter from in the Monterey. People in California have been faced with draconian measures on water in the last few weeks. You know, I'm told, you know, I should paint my grass green to avoid using water. There is a real problem. And the Monterey, maybe in the future, is going to suffer from water availability problems. But put it in perspective. US steel production in 2013, water usage was the equivalent of what would be 500,000 shale wells. US wheat production, the equivalent water usage is about 2.6 million shale gas wells. Water use in shale is very, very small compared with agriculture and other heavy industries. When I get asked questions about earth tremors, let's not glorify them by calling them earthquakes, but earth tremors, we still suffer in some areas relatively small shocks from coal mining. And I'm always wary, and I'm a little bit wary about the Marcellus. I'm wary about any area where we're going into areas with a legacy of coal mining, with all the associated problems. And, okay, I think this is fairly recent earthquake data. Yeah, I've not got all of this slide on, but you know, I can't remember on this which side is Scotland and which side is England. But political boundaries, I think it was Brian who showed a picture of the Eagleford, and his data actually stopped at the Mexican border. Now, obviously the geology doesn't, but we don't have all that much data from the Eagleford in Mexico. I'm intrigued also, talking about population density, you'd never guess on that one which side is Mexico, would you? But the serious point is in well costs. If you're on the US side of the Eagleford, you can drill a pretty complicated well with 40, 50 frac stages. I would say most of the costs I see are about 5, 6, 7 million. You just go across the border into Mexico, and the cost of a much simpler well goes up by a factor of 5 or 6. So it's not just a political border with different population densities, it's a cost thing as well. And this is probably about the infrastructure thing that David mentioned, about the development of the service industries, north and south of the border. And John Simmons gave a talk at the Geological Society a few weeks ago about communicating contested geosites. This is just, I think it's my only APG slide, but the objective of APG and Unconventionals is to address the public figures that drove widespread activism in places as different as New York, United Kingdom and France, and how that will change. I don't see things changing too much in New York State and California in the next 10 years, probably. There's still going to be a lot of access. And there's a lot of public fear caused by misinformation. The point I made about changing perception and changing data in permitting, you can look at trends. This is from the Marcellus, produced one for the Utica as well. But there is a lot of change over the year in where companies are doing deals, where companies are getting permits, where companies are drilling wells. And the data is good enough that we don't really need to get too involved. The spatial mapping, the GIS is good enough, and you can do that by companies as well. Now the pessimism. I said, stupidly, back in 2003, my colleagues said, we don't expect any large-scale commercial, and commercial is the key word there, shale oil and gas developments outside North America before 2030. I might change my views now to possibly include Russia, China, Argentina, but not much has changed. I don't know what's going to go on in the Middle East in the next 20 years, 30 years in unconventionals. And I don't necessarily understand what will go on in France and Bulgaria, or I don't think we'll lift the moratorium drilling and fracking, I should say, in California and New York. Now, communication. This is down at Balcombe on the second day of the so-called protest. And those guys, there's a kind of rotund geologist at the fence there, and he is trying to have a discussion with environmental people from Grindrod and their engineers. And these guys in the foreground are from Channel 4, and they asked me some remarkably technical questions for media people, and I did my best to answer them as succinctly as possible. But you can see by the nature of the population here, you know, this is a fairly low-key protest at that time, but it kicked off soon after that into something a little bit more disturbing. Yeah, I said I'd make the point about seismic, and I'm getting to the end of what I want to say here. I find it very easy to map, even with the limited seismic I've got, it's very easy to map the Eagle Ford. I don't see much in the variation in thickness. I don't see many facies changes. The upper marker is quite clear. The lower marker is quite clear. It's pretty easy stuff to interpret. I'll do this fairly quickly, but again, you know, if you talk to petrophysicists like Anshan Manu or Dave Sendra still here, they will emphasize the complexity of doing petrophysics in unconventionals. And I see it as, it's not just the complexity of the clay minerals, but it's things like the phosphates, the sulfides, the sulfates, the carbonates and their diagenesis that really do make not just the lithology determination difficult, but certainly the saturations. It's a real difficult world out there. That's it. Okay, I'm going to finish now, and David might have a few more comments. But sorry to be such a pessimist for the world outside 3 particular plays in the US.
Thank you, any questions? Yeah, please.
Sorry, Richie Whalen, JKX. I just wanted to say it's actually nice to hear something which is even more pessimistic than my very, very pessimistic view. Having been somebody who's been involved in Eastern Europe for the last 7 or 8 years and watched the start in Poland, the start in Romania, the start in Bulgaria, to see where we are now, I just totally agree.
You know, I'm really quite fascinated. I'll be fascinated to go across to Warsaw next month and really just see if there is anything new out there. But, as you say, I don't think there really will.
Peter Dolan, speaking for myself, rather than a corporate hat. I speak as a geologist and an optimist, but I've got 2 or 3 comments to make. The first one is I think Mike Daly was generous. I think that this industry is in utero. It hasn't been born yet. We don't have an infant. Secondly, I think that money being no object, I have the confidence in my peer community here that we could match the geological and engineering achievements that they have in the US, but that's money being no object. The third thing is, I think we might be distracted a little bit by putting all this effort into Unconventionals here. I just wonder if I was an investor, which I am actually in certain companies, would I really want to put money into such a poor quality business proposition? I don't think so. I think for UK PLC, the best thing we could be doing is investing in gas storage to secure our future. I'll let people comment.
Somebody else was waving. Yeah, please. In the middle.
Alice Woodrow from Gemini. I think far from being a pessimist, you're a realist, and I think I probably agree with everything you've said. It's extraordinary, over the last 45 years that I've been involved, we have struggled to translate the US model outside the US on every front. Geologically, in terms of drilling, contracting, politically, and of course in being paid royalty for every round of oil that comes out. So I just don't see that we can translate. And it has gone on for years. Tight gas, we tried to translate out of the US, Ohio in the 70s, and we weren't able to achieve it. And we still struggle. And I think the same issue, translation of the US model overseas, it just doesn't work.
Can I just ask you something, Alistair? One thing I didn't really say a great deal about, because I think it's a very different geological business model, is CSM, coal methane, whatever. I don't see, okay, I think there's been a lot of CBM wells drilled in the UK, even in recent years. But I wonder if that will move on to some success. I don't see a vast amount of enthusiasm for CBM in the States, apart from maybe 3 basins. So I wondered if you had any thoughts about the future of CBM. Sorry to...
No, gosh, it's an interesting observation. I think probably so much of the coal from the US actually is open cast mining. They don't have a lot of deep coal, which might lend itself to that sort of technique, whereas UK perhaps does. But as somebody's alluded to, the UK is so vaulted that I don't even get anything in a horizontal sense to work.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting, I was just thinking about the US and why things happen there. I mean, you do in the US see some real strong characters who sort of force things to happen. There's Michael Halbuty and George Mitchell who died recently. And in fact, one of the guys that's associated with Kimmeridge has the same sort of force. And you don't see that here somehow. Whether we're too blind, but you see these guys who are now in the 70s and 80s, which I'll be approaching soon, but that's a different point. But they have this enormous aggression towards, let's get this done. There's a real cultural issue there. And they lead the industry. They lead the industry.
I think there is... Sorry. I think there is a danger in many of them, certainly not me, thinking of these people as, the old boys, the grand old boys of the US industry. But I really respect it. I worked with Michael Booty and I talked to George Mitchell, and I got so much out of talking to those people. Not just their aggression, but enthusiasm for the business. And that has rubbed off, certainly on me, but on many people across there as well. And I talked to many young geoscientists coming out of, some really bright people coming out of the universities. And I see that enthusiasm and excuse me, the mentoring being passed on, which is good news for the future.
Roger Derry, I'm retired. I was involved with one of the very early CBM wells in Scotland, and that really failed because everything was so broken up and you couldn't get a decent veg or decent length of well. And the place where CBM is really being tested is in Queensland, where we're about to start feeding several LNG plants, and I think that remains to be seen in a little bit.
Yeah, maybe there's a view that Australia has some other sources of gas that will go first.
Well,
Hamish, please. Yeah, go on.
no, it's pretty close.
Yeah.
I think I fully accept the issues of pessimism, but clearly, I think as a British citizen, I think we owe it to ourselves to test those shales. We haven't actually fracked one and got gas to surface, so we just don't know. And so I think we in the UK have to let it happen, or allow it. We want to see it happen to assess that we've got a gas resource there. Now, clearly there are all staff evaluations, so I think I encourage the explorers in this to test it. And I think internationally, we're all going to be driven by economics. If a country seriously wants to develop its hydrocarbon wealth, it will make it happen. And again, we haven't actually tested these shale wells, so we don't know. And I think we have to earn ourselves. We've got to find out.
Yeah.
And explorers in us, will have to go out and test them.
Okay, sorry, please. Yeah, say who you are.
Yeah, hi, Nick Gridley, Mel Pompeo, and certainly I am one of the enthusiasts. But I think that there are, I'd like your opinion on this. UK shale compared to the US, we have three things. One thing is a very bad, this British perpetual hand-wringing that will, which is why we're still talking about a Heathrow third runway 20 years later, that kind of stuff. But in the UK, the entry costs are nothing, and the sovereign risk is moderate. But in the worst case scenario, when we are going to be looking at US LNG exports arriving here in about 15 months, we can be looking at $8 gas. And that, I think, solves a lot of problems.
Okay.